everybody's got access to a Bible, because I'm going to have you all reading something, either electronically or whatever. Okay.
Hi, Rob.
Hi, Gerald. Okay, I'll wait for Clark to get here. All right, so we're going to be taking a look at what this book calls the boldest but the least popular books in the Bible, which is 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And so if I was really going to do this right, I would spend today looking at chapters 1 through 9, which is the longest genealogy in the Bible.
Wow.
But if I did that, none of you would be here next week. So I have to give you some teasers to come back next week. And actually, okay, well, I'll start that in a minute. Teaser number 1, okay. Go to 1 Chronicles chapter 20. Chapter 20, verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, Joab led out the army, ravaged the country of the Ammonites, and came and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. Okay, what's supposed to come next? What's supposed to come next after that verse? You've heard it preached on in sermons 1,000 times. What does David do back in Jerusalem? He's on his roof looking out and sees Bathsheba bathing.
I have with Bathsheba in parentheses there. Yes.
Right. So where is that in 1 Chronicles? In fact, if you look back, okay, so look at verse 2. But David remained at Jerusalem. This is before verse 2. Joab attacked Rabbah and overthrew it, and David took the crown of Milcom from his head, and he found that it weighed, blah, 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 blah. So Chronicles completely skips the Bathsheba story, the Uriah story, the baby being killed, Nathan coming up, thou art the man, the story, all of that is gone. Now, what's interesting there's several interesting things there. Clearly, by looking at verse 1 in Chronicles, he had access to 2 Samuel. Because he quoted him. He lifted the verse exactly from 2 Samuel and moved it in 1 Chronicles. But then, why didn't he keep going? Okay, and that's teaser number 1, is because next week we're going to spend the class talking about David from the chronicle perspective. So part of what happens is he takes out all the interesting stories about David, throws them away, and just keeps the boring lists and in the view of the chronicler, David can do no wrong. The only thing David does wrong in Chronicles, and we're going to look at that one in just a second, is take a census of the people. That's actually in both books. But he also, when he took that one verse out, he must have assumed that his readers didn't have access to 2 Samuel, or else his readers would have said, wait a minute, there's something missing here. So we kind of got to think about his mindset as he's writing this book. I want to, taking a few things from here, a few things from there, but I'm going to mix them up a little bit. I'm going to, do some things. Okay. Second teaser, chapter 20. Well, I'm going to read 2 Samuel 24, verses 1 and 2. 2 Samuel 24, verses 1 and 2. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go, count the people of Israel and Judah. So the king said to Joab and the commanders of the army who were with him, go through all the tribes of Israel, and from Dan to Beersheba, and take a census. And Joab said, oh, no, that would be wrong. That's 2 Samuel 24, verses 1 and 2. Okay. So who incited David to take that census? The text we just read. The Lord did.
Says the Lord.
The Lord incited. Okay, now let's turn to 1 Chronicles 21. Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. So David said to Joab, notice the difference? Again, he had the text. Have you ever read something in the Bible that you wish was different? Well, that's kind of what the chronicler did. And he said, okay, I'll fix that. I'll rewrite it the way it should be. He didn't change 2 Samuel, but he changed it in his text. Somehow instead of the Lord inciting, now it's Satan inciting. It makes a lot more sense, actually. But that's kind of the lost in wonderland world that the chronicler lives in, and that's what we'll be looking at over the next few weeks. Okay. So let's do some introductory stuff before we get into the 9 chapters of genealogy. So what is it about this first and second business? Why do we have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles? That's a question. Well, the short answer is that they were too long. Okay, imagine books being written on scrolls. In a book written on a scroll, you get a certain size and you can't handle it. It just gets too cumbersome. So these 3 books happen to be, if they weren't split apart, these would be the 3 longest books in the Bible by word count. And it's actually Kings, Chronicles, Samuel, longer than Psalms. Okay. But because they were so long, and especially once they translated it into Greek. Greek is a lot wordier than Hebrew, and so they got longer when they're translated into Greek. And so that's the reason we got 3 of them. In the Hebrew Bible, this book is called the Book of the Days. Okay. The Book of the Days. St. Jerome, early Christian era, in his translation, he called it Chronicles, and that's stuck. And my cutesy name for this class is Do You Get The Chronicle? And the idea is that we still use that word. That chronicle is a word that we understand. It's kind of a history, day-to-day kind of over time period thing. But in fact, chrono is a clock, a chronometer is a timepiece. So one of the interesting things about Chronicles is that it identifies 18 different sources. And let's look at one of them. Let's look at 2 Chronicles 29:29. 2 Chronicles 29:29. Is it for a second? No, 1 Chronicles, I'm sorry. 1 Chronicles 29:29. The end of the David story. Very end of 1 Chronicles, actually. Thus David and Jesse reigned over all David, son of Jesse, reigned over all Israel. The period that he reigned was 40 years. He reigned 7 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. He died in a good old age, full of days, riches, and honor. By the way, the whole deathbed scene in 1 Kings, not here. Okay. He died. This is his death of David passage. Right. And then 29 says, Now the acts of King David, from first to last, are written in the records of the seer Samuel, and in the records of the prophet Nathan, and in the records of the seer Gad, with accounts of all his rule and his might and all the events that fell upon him. So he acknowledges sources more than pretty much anybody else in the Bible does. Acknowledge that these are some other books you can go check out. date. So when was it written? Well, the genealogies go, the last event that occurs in the book is the people returning to Israel from Babylonian captivity, which happened in, I always get those dates, 539 BC. Okay. So it was at least after that. But he's also got some genealogies that show like 7 generations. Well, Jehoiachin, because it's a Jehoiakim. So Jehoiachin was the second to last king of Judah before the exile. And he has his genealogy going, including all the way 7 generations later. So 7 generations, depending on how long you call a generation, 20, 30, 40 years. That gets you into the 300s or so. And especially when you consider how close this is to Ezra and Nehemiah, that they're all considered to have been written about the same time. So that's probably around 330 or so, which is Alexander the Great's time. That's kind of the best guess right now for when this was written. And David was about 1000 BC. So this is a long, long time. From 1000 BC to 330. And remember, the numbers go backwards when you go BC. Hard to keep track of that for me. So sometime in the 360, 330 BC or so. So who wrote it? Okay. Traditionally, Ezra was considered to have written it. In fact, if you look at 2nd Chronicles, the last 2 verses of 2nd Chronicles, Second Chronicles 36, starting with verse 22. So they've got 2 long verses here. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. And then if you turn 1 page over to Ezra and look at the first 3 verses of Ezra. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, it's exactly the same. So again, somebody copied somebody, right? And whether that was intended to signal that, okay, Ezra wrote both books, or whether it was just kind of saying, somebody's piggybacking on somebody else, don't know. I think that's about, I can't think of another place where two Bible books have the same words like that, especially when they're one right after the other one. Modern scholars are pushing back on that idea, and one reason is that their theology is different. Among the more unpleasant aspects of Ezra, if you've ever studied Ezra, this is a part you shake your head about. He had a really big thing about mixed marriages, about Jews marrying non-Jews. And Nehemiah did too. Both Ezra and Nehemiah both. In fact, at the end, the last 2 chapters of Ezra, he goes off on a rant about people that had married Gentile women, or had a Gentile son for their daughter, or daughter for their son, or whatever. And at the very end of the book of Ezra, they have a big meeting, and all these people divorce their wives, and the last verse of Ezra, that's Nehemiah. The last verse of Ezra is all these, and there's a big long list of people, naming and shaming, okay, big long list of people that did that. In the last verse of Ezra, all of these had married foreign women, and they sent them away with their children. And that's the last we ever hear about them. Wow. We haven't, I'm serious. That's not one of the high points of the Old Testament. But when you look, you don't see that in the Chronicles. In fact, we're going to look at something a little bit later. He goes into great detail about the descendants of Esau, that the Edomites, who other books really are down on, but he just, and these are the kings of Edom, blah, 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 and blah, blah, and blah, blah. So, see, I did do some genealogy there.
Ezra and Nehemiah both heavily influenced by the exile period, though.
Yeah, yeah.
So that would make.
Yeah, I mean, they were trying to recreate their, the people.
Yeah.
So they were, But anyway, that's, yeah, Joe.
Didn't Ezra canonize the Old Testament? Wasn't he the one that put the Old Testament together?
That would probably be around the right time, 330 or so.
What I
Yeah.
have learned.
Yeah, okay. It could, I mean, yeah, I don't know, he didn't do it in the book of Ezra, but he might have been, because everything was pretty fluid for a long time.
Yeah.
But that's, yeah. Very could have done that. Of course, canonize is, that's a modern concept, and again, you can't have a book this big between two covers. They have scrolls. There are lots of scrolls. That's when we got first and seconds. Okay. Other questions? That's our intro. Intro to the Chronicles. Okay. Any thoughts before we dive into the genealogies? Okay. So, I got to read you the first couple of verses. First verse of, let me read first three verses of First Chronicles. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. I mean, who wouldn't love this? They don't even have verbs. I don't know that I was ever assigned Adam, Seth, Enosh as a memory verse when I was growing up. That would have been a really easy one. So, I mean, that goes on for 9 chapters. He does get some verbs in there eventually. Okay. So anytime you do a genealogy, of course there's 2 of them in the New Testament, one I'm in Matthew, one I'm in Luke. I know those are the favorite parts of the Gospels. All right. One of the questions is, where do you start? And in fact, Matthew and Luke start in different places. Okay? Gail knows. So where does Matthew start? Abraham. All right? I mean, that's a fairly normal place for a Jewish genealogy to start. Where does Luke go back to? Adam. Yeah, Luke goes all the way back to Adam. And with the idea, usually the commentators say that Luke was trying to appeal to a Gentile audience. He was trying to have Jesus come from humanity and not just a Jewish Messiah. And maybe that's right, I don't know. So, okay, I'm going to say something you're not going to believe. Some of you may want to go home and check this. But Chronicles 1:1 is the only mention of Adam in the Old Testament after Genesis 5. Adam is not mentioned. I mean, he's a fairly big character in our, in the Bible in our mind. We think of Adam and Eve. Adam, Eve, and Eden show up in the New York Times crossword a lot. First lady. Oh, that's Eve. Okay, I mean, they show up a lot. That's a popular Bible story. It doesn't show up at all in the Old Testament, except in Genesis, Genesis 2 and 3, and then the genealogy that's copied over here in Genesis 5. So that's an interesting thought. And I was kind of thinking that about Noah. But then I looked it up, and Noah's mentioned a few times in the prophets. As in the days of Noah, when everybody was evil. They kind of use that phraseology. let me just kind of quickly walk you through these first 9 chapters. So, chapter 1 is descendants of Noah and descendants of Esau. You know, it kind of what he does. He starts off Adam, Seth, Enosh, and then he gets to Noah, and then he slows down. He says Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Yeah,
The descendants of
much-
Japheth
there's
are blah
much
blah blah.
more detail after Noah before.
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
It's incredibly spare, you don't get any of the rest of the kids or anything.
Yeah.
It's just the
Then he starts going through every one of the kids. It says, the descendants of Japheth, blah, 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 blah. That's Gomer. That's our favorite Gomer. Then verse, and you don't even really, you know, it just kind of goes along, and then it'll say, the descendants of Ham. Oh yeah, he's one of the, kind of look back up and see that one again. There's Havavah, and the descendants of Shem in verse 17, goes all the way down there. Sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael. And then he's got those, and then he gets, Abraham became the father of Isaac, the sons of Isaac, Esau and Israel. He always calls him Israel and not Jacob in this book. And then there he's got the descendants of, okay, starting in verse 38, I'm sorry, Seir, came the father of Isaac, sons of Isaac, Esau and Israel. The sons of Esau, Eliphaz, Ruel, Jerush, the sons of Seir, and goes all the way through. It says, these are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites. So it's almost like, hey, they were ahead of us. And that's one reason, you know, he seems to be much more friendly toward the Edomites than Ezra and Nehemiah would have been. So that's chapter 1, descendants of Noah, descendants of Esau. And then chapters 2 through 8 are the descendants of Israel, or Jacob. Okay? So, chapter 2, descendants of Judah. Chapter 3, descendants of David, who comes from Judah. Chapter 4 is more descendants of Judah and descendants of Simeon. And if you remember your Bible maps back when Bibles had maps, if you remember the land of the 12 tribes, Simeon was kind of lost in Judah because their land was kind of there. So that's one reason why Simeon was probably placed right there with Judah. This chapter 5, the descendants of Reuben, descendants of Gad, descendants of the half tribe of Manasseh. Okay, half tribe of Manasseh. All right, if you remember again your Old Testament maps, here's the Jordan River, Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River. 3 tribes settled on the east side of the Jordan, and it was those 3 tribes, Reuben, Gad, half tribe of Manasseh. As they were going through there, the conquest, they said, you know, this is good land for our flocks. We like it here. Can we stay on this side? We'll go help you conquer the other side, but we want to make our homes here. And so those 3 are lumped together in chapter 5. Chapter 6 is descendants of Levi, 81 verses. Descendants of Levi. I looked to see if this was one of the longest chapters in the Bible. 81 verses. That's, yeah, of course, Psalm 119 has 100 and something verses. Yeah. Yeah, 150 Psalms. Yeah. Yeah, we will find out as we keep going that he really, really likes Levites through the book. So some people have postulated that maybe he was a Levite. He likes Levites and he likes temple worship, as we'll see as we go through things. Chapter 7, descendants of Issachar, descendants of Benjamin, descendants of Naphtali. Oh, 1 verse for that. The descendants of Naphtali have 1 verse, chapter 6, verse 13, as opposed to 81 verses for the tribe of Levi. Okay. Descendants of Manasseh, descendants of Ephraim, descendants of Asher. Okay. All of those are covered in chapter chapter 8 is different descendants of Benjamin. So, then and then the chapter 9, I didn't put chapter 9 in my notes, but that's, the chapter 9 is genealogies of the major families that are coming back to Israel after the exile, is chapter 9. So, we're not gonna read. I read all those yesterday, so you wouldn't have to. Yeah, I mean, what do you get from a genealogy? I mean, it's somebody, if you Google that, somebody has put together a list of 1,216 names from now, a lot of those look like they're duplicates, so don't know about that, but there's a lot of names there. And 90% of them you've never heard of before. I mean, and I have not gone to research to see how many of those are never mentioned again in any other place in the Bible. But that's another research project somebody can do. So, a couple of questions about the genealogy. With 8 chapters dealing with descendants of Jacob, what happened to Dan and Zebulun? I know all of you were asking that. He skipped 2. Now, it could be that our copies are lost and but it could be that Dan and Zebulun were way over here. Again, if you imagine your Israel map, they were way over here, and maybe he just said, oh, I forgot about those guys. But they're not mentioned in the first 9 chapters.
There's a reason in the writer's mind that they're not listed, but he doesn't tell us why.
Yeah, and they do appear in other places in the book, not in these genealogies, but they are, he knew their names, but there are a few nuggets of theology that are kind of buried in there. If you look at chapter 9, verse 2, this is just before he starts on the genealogy of the people coming back from exile. So 9 verse 2 says, starting with verse 1. Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. Now the first to live again in their possessions and their towns were Israelites, priests, Levites, and temple servants. So that's again, there's some theology there about why did Israel get taken into exile? Well, because of their unfaithfulness. And that's going to be a theme. And that's kind of a theme in the whole Bible, isn't it? So, key question is, we'll come to an answer on this one the last week. So what drove the writer, let's just call him the chronicler, to write his book, or her book? Most of this stuff is covered elsewhere. Most of us, the stories that we remember from Sunday school come from 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. As you're gonna see, it's not news. This is, in some ways, this is kind of like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings with all the interesting stuff taken out. So part of what we're going to be doing is looking for theology as we go. Looking for, where was he coming from? Where was his head? What was he thinking as much as we can from the text itself? Okay.
I always thought genealogies like this, especially the long ones, were their way of fact checking. I mean, it was real. These are the people.
Well,
we're not just telling stories. Here are the people. You can go look them up. You can find out about them. It's like we do genealogies. We do that for ourselves.
Yeah.
And I always thought it was kind of like that.
Yeah. I mean, these first 9 chapters, it just came to me when you said this. It's kind of like their 23andMe.
Yeah.
you know, is their way to look up, says, oh yeah, there's my ancestor right there. Yeah,
Maybe, you know, he was trying to provide a service of somewhat, like, got a bunch of different sources.
yeah,
It's not all written down in one place. I'm gonna write it down in one place and help everybody. And sometimes when you say help, you know, you've got your own gloss on things, and
Mhm.
the stuff that you're interested in and you think is important is what you're gonna include. And
Yeah.
maybe you don't know about some other stuff and you leave it out, and so maybe this is just a way of, you know, the writer's way of, you know, explaining it all.
yeah. Let's gather this stuff up before it gets lost to
Right.
history. Yeah, Michael?
I also think that the period of exile, when they were so spread out, surrounded by folks that didn't believe
Yeah.
in God at all. And I think a lot of this has to do with cautionary tale for what happens if you depart from
Yeah,
God.
yeah. Well, and it helps to create a past for the people. And that's, I think, kind of what Gus was saying, yeah.
I also think it's hard for us because we can pick up our Bibles anytime we want and
Yeah.
refer back to any time period through the biblical history. And they couldn't do that. Many did not read, period, much less have any books, much less have a compilation of them.
I
You
think you
know.
use Google.
Pardon? You think they use Google? I don't know, there were a lot of rebels in this bunch of this chapter here, and, I think that might be part of the point of
Yeah.
the author, is to let us know, these are plain, real people, just like you live with
Yeah.
and I live with.
Well, and some of them, he actually identifies who married a woman from blank. And that's, gets into a few more details than, certainly than in verse 1. But, other thoughts about genealogies and,
Well, identity is important.
mhm, yeah,
And self-discovery is remembering
Yep.
your past and the fact that we are connected.
yeah, I think that's, you know, and that's what it came to me with the 23andMe, they built an industry, you know, they built a whole industry on people who want to know their roots. And there was an article in the New Yorker that there is actually a psychological thing that happens when somebody sends off and finds their roots and find out that their father's not who they thought he was. That happens often enough that actually it is a certain psychological thing that goes on, yeah.
Think about it from an archaeological standpoint, and I'm not an expert in archaeology, but I know someone who is. So that counts, right?
Yeah.
I know someone who is.
Yeah.
But anyway, you think about that because these names are popping up all of the time when, you know, when they're discovering places, they're
Mhm.
finding these names. These are real people.
Yeah.
They find the names written in other records.
Yeah. Okay.
I think also just them coming back from exile, being very Hellenized through their experiences, or, you know, from depending on where they were. But it's a call to those people, and those stories aren't your people and your stories. If you're coming back here and you
Yeah.
are Hebrew, this is your story.
Yeah.
Forget the rest. It's a call. It's sort of a call to bring the communities back to, this is what's really important. Those things you learned over there, that's
Mhm.
not us. This is us.
Yeah, and if you go back, chapter 3 is all about the descendants of David. And considering that descendants of David were the kings of Judah for some 400 years, that's possibly even a seditious list. Because if the Persians had that list, you can bet they would go through and kill everybody they could find that was a descendant of David. Because that's a threat to their rule. So, you know, that may even be hiding that information in a long, boring genealogy. It might be a smart thing to do. You know, it's It's there if you know how to look for it. Okay, so your homework assignment for next week, and it's not genealogy, not reading genealogies. Okay, we're gonna cover the rest of First Chronicles next week, which goes, it's, 10 through 30. Yeah, just read a couple of chapters a day. But it's the story of David, and I will give you permission to skip parts of it, because everything you think you know, we may do this next week, say, tell me David's stories that you know. David and Goliath, not there. Bathsheba, not there. Fighting with Saul, not there. I mean, all the interesting things that David did are not in Chronicles. And every once in a while, he will break into a list of federal officials. These were the people that David appointed to lead the worship in the temple. Blah, 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 blah. Name. You have my permission to skip those parts. Once you get to one of those. Oh, yeah, Gail?
Is the writer cleaning up history? Like, we have many people who do,
Yeah?
and take out anything that
Yeah.
might look
Yeah.
not great.
Yeah, I'm doing an election year, so.
That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah. Yeah, Mary?
Rob, I was sitting here wondering, regarding the contradictions between the census taking, the Lord commanding, and then the Satan, because I know in the Old Testament, God sometimes used his angels, to carry out his bidding, and they were sometimes called Satan.
Yeah.
The angels were called Satan, so I'm wondering if maybe the time where the word Satan is mentioned, that's because at that point God has used that Satan to test him, because like with Noah, not Noah, Job.
Job,
There was
yeah.
there was an angel who tested him. That angel was called a Satan.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if
Yeah.
God was trying to use as the time, as the function that God wanted them to perform to test these people. Then at that time they were called a Satan.
Right, and the word Satan actually means adversary.
Yeah.
Or
that's what I'm
accuser.
talking about. Yeah.
And that's a good point to make, is that the word Satan in the Old Testament doesn't have horns and a red suit and a tail,
Like the
and a
New
pitchfork.
Testament.
Yeah. I mean, that's not the devil that we see, in our imagination. In fact, in the story of Job, Satan came before, was
Yeah.
always with all the other angels, and came, oh, you considered your servant Job.
Yeah.
So, I mean, could very well be the fact reflects a difference in the meaning of that individual.
That was still God, in other words. They
Yeah.
tested him through his angel,
Yeah,
like with Job.
but it does sound a lot better when you say Satan. Okay, so next week we will get to David, a very cleaned up life of David we'll look at in the rest of the book of Chronicles. And then we will move over to Second Chronicles, which is kings of the southern kingdom, basically. So, more to come. So thank you for coming and changing your clocks.